Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, How Speed Impacts SEO Performance. I'm Andrea, your host for today, and a tech SEO consultant and partner at Elementive. And of course, also on the webinar is my business partner and presenter for today, Matthew. We really hope that today's webinar will serve as a good refresher on the fundamentals of website speed and introduce you to Google's new Core Web Vitals metric, INP. Before we get started, I want to share a little bit more about who we are and what we do. Matthew and I formed Elementive in 2014 and have worked together for over 14 years in total. We specialize in helping a wide variety of businesses, individuals, and teams identify and resolve the technical issues that are impacting their website's performance. If you'd like to learn more about who we are, I hope that you will check out our website at elementive.com. Before I have Matthew get started, I also want to let you know that we've reserved the last few minutes of the webinar to answer any questions you might have. So please feel free to post those in chat and we'll get to those at the end of the webinar. We'll also be sending out a recording of the webinar to everyone who signed up later this week. So please feel free to look at for that in your inbox. Once again, thank you so much for joining us today. And Matthew, I will let you take it from here.
Sounds good. So hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us here today. I'm excited to talk to you about website speed, how it affects SEO, and the new Core Vitals metric, Interaction to Next Paint, or INP. So let's start there, talking about Interaction to Next Paint, what it is, and what we all need to be thinking about with it. So Interaction to Next Paint became a Core Vitals metric last month, officially started on March 12th, though it started recording data on February 12th. Google starts measuring Core Vitals metrics 28 days before they actually take effect. So INP data will go back to February in Google's reports. So INP replaced another metric called FID, which stood for First Input Delay. FID and INP are both ways of measuring interactivity on a website and measuring how long it takes for people to use the website overall. But they do things in slightly different ways. So I'll talk about some of the differences between FID and INP here as we go along. But to start off with, let's talk about what INP is. So INP measures how quickly the website is able to respond when somebody goes to the website and starts interacting with it. It doesn't look at all interaction types, only looks at specific kinds of interactions. It looks at click interactions, tap interactions, or interactions involving the keyboard, either a virtual or physical keyboard. So it does not take into account things like scrolling on the website. It's only taking into account you clicked on a link, you tapped on a button, you interacted with a form by pressing on it, and then the website was supposed to respond in some kind of way to that interaction. What's interesting about INP is it measures all interactions on the website, and it looks at all of those and it records how long it takes for all those interactions to occur. And then whatever the longest interaction time is recorded as the page's final INP score for that visitor. And that's important to keep in mind. There's a lot of information out there that's wrong about this, that says that INP is an average of all interaction times, or says that it's taking some sort of cumulative interaction time across all interactions. That's not the case. It's looking at all the interaction times on the page individually, then it's recording the longest one of those interaction times that happened. So when you see an INP score, that doesn't mean all interaction times. That just means that the longest interaction on that page was that length of time. So to understand INP, it's really important to understand what an interaction is. So let's talk about the different parts of an interaction. So there's three parts to an interaction. The first part of an interaction is something called input delay. So when a visitor goes to the website and they start interacting with it, so they click on a link or they tap on a button or they're typing something into a form, the website isn't necessarily able to respond right away, right? The browser might be busy processing something else for that website, might be busy loading images or playing a video or loading a JavaScript file or trying to change something else about the design of the page. And so the browser is really busy doing all those other things, and it can't actually get to the interaction that the visitor had. It can't get to it right away. The analogy that tends to come up a lot with this is thinking of it like a checkout line at a store. You get in line and you have to wait and wait and wait until it's your turn. Sometimes that line is really long, the wait is really long, sometimes it's really quick. And that's what input delay is trying to measure. How long does it take before the browser is even able to do something in response to that interaction? And if the input delay is long, you can have the fastest code that you want that responds to the interaction. It isn't going to matter if it takes too long to get to that interaction. So you want to understand what that input delay is, because that's going to be a really big part of why IMP is high in a lot of cases. The next part of an interaction is something called processing time. So processing time is once we've gotten through the input delay, the browser is actually able to start responding to the interaction. It's actually able to start executing code related to this interaction, but that's going to take a while. And sometimes it's going to take a long while. Sometimes it's not going to take too long at all. It depends on what that interaction is. If it's something quick, like we need to change something that's hidden to viewable, that's going to be pretty quick for the browser to execute that code and change. Not a lot of processing needs to happen. But you take a different kind of interaction. You take something like a load more button on a website. That could take a lot of time to process, right? Because with the load more button, visitor gets to the bottom of the page, they click on load more, then all of a sudden the browser has to figure out a lot of different things with that load more. It has to figure out how it's going to change the design of the page. It has to recalculate layouts. It has to recompute styles for the page. Probably that code also needs to make a request to the server, and that server is going to have to do some kind of work to generate the additional content and generate the additional code and then send that content back to the browser. The browser is then going to have to do additional work with what it's received from the server to load the page. It's a lot of stuff that has to happen to process that interaction, and that can take a lot of time. This is one of the areas that we see take the most time when it comes to IMP on sites that we work with. And that's just down to there's a lot of different things that have to happen, a lot of different things for the browser to process for that interaction. The third part and final part of an interaction is the presentation delay. So as the browser is going through and executing all the code related to the interaction, at some point in that code, there's going to be some kind of instruction that tells the browser that something needs to be painted back to the page, something needs to be presented or displayed back to the page for the visitor to actually see. And in some cases, there's a lot of time between when that code starts, when that paint operation is initiated in the code, and when something actually shows up on the page. There might be really involved animations. There might be really intricate ways that images move into the page, right? Like really fancy graphics or something like that, that slows down how long it takes for something to be painted. So if that's the case on your website, you're going to have a longer presentation delay on here because it's going to take longer for the browser to move between when it says, okay, I need to start painting, to when it can actually start painting on the website. So those are the three parts of an interaction. You've got the input delay, the processing time, and the presentation delay. And you can see those on this graphic from web.dev. And down here at the bottom, we've got input delay, processing time, and presentation delay. And you can see how these things all relate between when there's an interaction and when there's something actually presented back to the visitor. This graphic also starts to highlight the difference between INP and the metric it replaced, FID. So FID, first input delay, only measured the very first part of the interaction, the input delay. And it only measured that very first part of the interaction for the very first interaction with the page. So it was a very narrowly focused metric that looked at only one part of one interaction with the page. And in contrast, INP looks at the entire interaction with the website, right? It looks at the input delay, the processing time, the presentation delay, and it looks at that for all the interactions that are happening on the website. So INP is a much more comprehensive metric. It's able to tell you more about what people are actually doing on the page, what kind of experience people probably have on the page than FID was ever able to. So I'm actually really glad that Google replaced this. And these are some of the reasons that Google did end up replacing it, because they wanted something that was a more comprehensive look at the user experience. It's a more interesting metric and more telling metric that we can really use. So the question becomes, well, what do we need to do with INP? How do we actually make it? And what kind of targets do we need to aim for when we're trying to improve INP? So Google's target here is that INP needs to be under 200 milliseconds. And that doesn't mean that everybody needs to have an interaction time under 200 milliseconds. With all of Google's core vitals metrics, what they're aiming for is that the 75th percentile of users have an interaction time under 200 milliseconds. And if you look at your website in PageSpeed Insights, you can find out what the interaction to next paint time is for different pages on your website. And it will give you the distribution of how many people had different INP scores. So on the case on the screenshot on the left, we've got an overall INP of 172 milliseconds. That means that the 75th percentile of visitors was 172 milliseconds. 75% of people had an INP of 172 milliseconds or less. But then you can see the distributions. 80% of people had a good INP, meaning it was below the 200 millisecond threshold. 16% of people were somewhere in the middle between 200 milliseconds and 500 milliseconds. And given that this one looks pretty good, probably people were a little closer to the 200 millisecond end of that spectrum, right? And then 4% of people had a poor INP. And that's okay. You're always going to see people who have a poor INP. This is also true of any other core vitals metric that you're looking at. There's going to be some percentage of people that just have a slow experience with the page, either down to their connection or down to problems with how the website loaded for them, something about their browser, something about their device, right? There's going to be something that makes their experience with the page a little bit slower. But you want to make sure it looks something more like the one on the left side of the screen, where it's a very small percentage of people, but the majority of people had a good experience. In contrast, we have the one on the right side of the screen, where we have 495 milliseconds as our 75th percentile INP score. And if you look at the distributions, this one's not a great experience to use this website. It's going to be really slow to interact with. It's going to take a long time to respond when visitors try to click. It's going to take a long time to actually show something back to the visitor when they are trying to use the website. And that's going to make it feel really slow and unresponsive and probably just a frustrating experience overall. And you can see that in the distributions. Only 36% of people had a good INP with this website, but a full quarter of people, 24%, had a poor INP score of over 500 milliseconds, meaning they're waiting over half a second for the website to do something after they click on something or tap on something on the website. So you can get those in PageSpeed Insights. The other way that we like to measure INP is with a free tool from Debug Bear called INP Debugger. So INP Debugger will go through and it will simulate interactions with your website. So you put in a page and it will go through and it will try to click on all the buttons that it can, or tap on all the links that it can, or fill out any of the forms that exist on your website, and it will see how long it takes to respond. So this is only one way of looking at it. It's a simulation. It's not real data like PageSpeed Insights is showing, but it's a pretty helpful way to look at your website and get a sense of, do you have a problem or not? Is there some kind of issue coming up or not? And it's a free tool, so you can go and use that on Debug Bear's website. And then once you run it, you'll get a list of all the possible interaction points on your website and how long it took. So in the case of my website, you can see the Start Now button in my website's footer. It's a click interaction, and the duration was 148 milliseconds. So that means it took 148 milliseconds for my website to respond when they tried to click on that particular button. And 148 milliseconds is within that 200 millisecond window that we're aiming for, right? So that's a good INP score. That said, for clicking on a link, 148 milliseconds is probably a bit long. So there's still a little bit of work that maybe could be done if I really wanted to, but we're within the thresholds on that one. So then the question becomes, how do you improve IMP? So you've looked at it, maybe you have a problem with IMP and you realize it's a bit too long. So what do you need to do to improve this? And the big hint here is that how you fix IMP is it depends on which part of the interaction is causing slower speeds. So if input delay is the reason for a slower INP time, then you want to look at what other files are running. What's keeping the browser too busy to respond to those interactions? Why is the browser unable to do something in response to the visitor? So that could be other files that are loading. That could be other things that are happening on the website. That could be third-party scripts that are stalling the browser and preventing it from being able to respond to visitors. You want to step through and you want to try and understand all those different things that might be happening to slow it down. So in this case, you're not going to work on the interaction point itself directly. You're going to work on it indirectly. You're going to look at the other things that were happening that might have been preventing the browser from doing what it needed to do in response to the interaction. If your issue is with processing time, and like I said before, this is typically where we see the issue exists, is with processing time, then you really want to look at the code that is being used to respond to that interaction. And what is it about that code that is taking too long to respond? Is it just that there's a lot of stuff that has to happen? In which case, can you simplify that a little bit? Can you make that run more efficiently? Can you maybe simplify what the interaction needs to be? Maybe if it is something like a load more button, you don't need to load as much content in response. You can find other ways to load that content in that's maybe going to work a little bit more quickly. So this often requires working on JavaScript code, but sometimes it requires working on server-side code. Sometimes it requires working on HTML or CSS and trying to simplify that down as well. Your ultimate goal here is you want to make sure that you're running that code as efficiently as possible so that way it can process as quickly as possible in response to the visitor's interaction. Now, the last part of this is presentation delay. And there's two different things you need to think about in terms of presentation delay to improve INP. The first one is you want to prioritize painting whatever the output needs to be from this interaction. So when you think about the code that needs to run in response to the interaction, oftentimes there's a lot of different operations that have to happen in the code, right? You take something like the load more example. You have to figure out how the page is going to be restyled. You have to make a call to the server to get new content. The server has to do work and so on, right? There's a lot of different operations that have to happen. And usually how code gets written is the paint operations are the last of those operations. So everything else happens, step 1 through however many, happen first. And then at the very end of the process, the painting behaviors begin. And you want to think about that a little bit differently. You want to try and move the painting operations as high in that order as possible. In some cases, you can even put paint operations first by painting something like a load more icon or painting some kind of message back to the visitor that says, yeah, we know that you clicked, we know that you want something, we are working on it, we are processing something. That way you're showing something back to the visitor more immediately. That's all IMP is trying to measure, right? It's trying to measure how quickly the browser is able to paint something back in response to that interaction. Doesn't mean that it has to be the final thing in response to that interaction, just means it has to be something in response to that interaction that's shown within that 200 millisecond time window. So the more that you can step through that code and prioritize the paint operation, show something as quickly as possible back to the visitor, the more you're going to make for a better experience on the website, and the more you're going to improve your website's IMP. Now, the other way that you can improve presentation delay is by improving and optimizing how you present information back in response to that interaction. So if you have really fancy animations and really fancy graphics that are used to respond to that interaction, that's going to take longer to come back. But if you simplify those animations, use more effective code, then you're going to probably be able to present that back more quickly. And the caveat here, right, as with everything with speed, is that the fastest website is one that has no images, has no fonts, has no CSS to design the page, and so on, right? It's a very simple, boring, basic, plain text page. Nobody wants that. So at some point, we do have to make trade-offs between really fancy graphics and really fast speeds. And maybe in your case, you really want those really awesome animations to load things back to the page. You really want things to slide in a certain way or come in with really interesting interesting graphics or something, maybe that's really important to do. And that's fine, but just know that the trade-off is that your presentation delay is going to be really high. And so you want to allow that to be really high and then focus instead on getting your processing time and your input delay as fast as possible. So that way the majority of those 200 milliseconds can be spent on the presentation side of things. So as you go through and think about IMP, really the first step is figure out where you have a problem. Is it input delay, processing time, or presentation delay? And then make those changes accordingly. So I've been talking a lot here, and PowerPoint decided to go crazy. I mean, let's go back to the right slide. There we go. So I've been talking a lot here about Core Vitals metrics, and those are important, right? Core Vitals matters, but there are other speed metrics that we need to think about. And I want to talk a little bit about what those other speed metrics are that we need to look at on our website. So Core Vitals, right, is Google's 3 metrics that they look at to evaluate website speed. So it's interaction to next paint, largest contentful paint, and cumulative layout shift. Those are the 3 that they're using. And those are important. You want to pay attention to those. You want to measure those on your website. But to improve Core Vitals, you usually need to focus on some of the other metrics that are happening on your website and describing other parts of your website speed. And what we often find is that by focusing on those other metrics, you'll actually end up improving Core Vitals as well, because those other metrics actually describe other problems that are worsening Core Vitals. And so by improving those other metrics, you'll indirectly improve Core Vitals as well. So it becomes really helpful to pay attention to those other metrics. The other thing that we see is those other speed metrics sometimes have a bigger impact on conversions and user experience than the Core Vitals metrics do. And that's not to say Core Vitals metrics don't have an impact, right? They do, especially interaction text paint, largest contentful paint. There's a lot of studies that show how both of those relate to conversions and how improving those can improve conversions. But in a lot of cases, improving other metrics can have an even bigger impact on the user experience and on your conversions as well. So as you think about all the other metrics that exist on a website, there's a lot of different words. There's a lot of different jargon that's going to be thrown around and a lot of different acronyms that'll be thrown around. The way I like to think about those different metrics, and the thing that I think is the most helpful to keep track of what all those different metrics are, is to remember that all the metrics we're trying to do is tell you a story about how the website loads. And like any story, there's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end to that. And so when you come across a new metric that you maybe aren't familiar with or you don't know, your first question should be, okay, where does this fit? What is this telling me? So I came across a metric like time to first byte. Well, where does that fit? Does that fit toward the beginning of the website loading process? Does it fit toward the middle, toward the end? And then by understanding where it fits, that changes how you're going to fix things on the website. So if it's toward the beginning, that's a very different set of things you're going to address, as opposed to if it's toward the end, that's a bunch of different things you're going to need to address with the website. So as you go through, you want to think about all those different metrics as they fit on the timeline. And I've got the timeline up here on this screen where you move through from one metric to the next, to the next, to the next. And you can kind of see these metrics in order. This also helps you kind of think through how these metrics might impact each other. If you take a metric like first contentful paint, it's going to be affected by the things that happen before it. DOM content loaded, time to first byte. And you take something like time to interactive, it's going to be affected by a lot of other things that happen before it. Right? So by thinking about these things in order, by thinking about these things in a timeline, it really helps you get a better sense of where the metrics fit and how they're affecting each other. So let's talk through some of these different stages of the website loading process and go through them and talk about some of the metrics that matter at each of these stages. So starting with the initial connection, the very first part of the website load. So at the very first part of the website load, what's happening? Well, the first thing that has to happen is the visitor has to request the page. And after the visitor goes to their browser and requests the page, the browser has to figure out where that website exists. And they do that by looking up the website's DNS information. That returns an IP address of that particular website. The browser then establishes a connection to that IP address. It's called a TCP connection or TCP IP. If you've ever heard that acronym, that's what that's referring to, is establishing that connection. Most websites these days use an SSL certificate, right? HTTPS instead of HTTP. And so the browser and the server have to figure out how they're going to talk in a secure manner via that particular SSL certificate. And then once they figured out the security and once they figured out the connection, then they actually have to figure out what page was requested. So the browser sends a request along, and then the server has to go through and process everything and build everything in response to that request and has to send that back to the browser. The browser then starts receiving information from the server byte by byte, right? Most websites are millions of bytes, so there's a lot of stuff that's coming back from the server to the browser. So we can measure this initial connection, all the stuff that I just talked about, with a metric called time to first byte. So time to first byte measures the time between when the visitor requested the web page and when the first byte of data was sent back from the server. And by using time to first byte, we can get a pretty good sense of how long this initial part of our website is taking to load. And if we see the time to first byte is really high on our website for one reason or another, well, then it doesn't really matter about anything else with our website loading, right? Because the time to first byte is slow. The initial connection is slow. The initial connection is slow. Everything else on our website will be too. But by improving time to first byte, we can speed everything else up as well. So time to first byte becomes a really important metric to look at and monitor on a regular basis to see if you have any of those problems with the initial loading stages. And if you do, then that's a really important issue you need to go in and start figuring out how to address. Then we move into the middle stages of the website loading process. And at these middle stages, the browser is receiving all the code from the server and it has to figure out what to do with that. So it has to figure out what it's going to do with the HTML code. Well, how does it structure the HTML code? How does it actually take that HTML code and present it in some way back to the visitor, right? How does it put that onto the page for the visitor to see? And along with HTML, we've got JavaScript files. It has to go through and execute all those different JavaScript files. And those JavaScript files are going to change the page's content, change how the page looks, how the page is laid out, and so on, right? So it has to make a request to the server, get those JavaScript files, has to execute those JavaScript files, and figure out what to do with them. It has to do the same thing with CSS files. It has to go through each CSS file and figure out how the page needs to be styled. It has to figure out how the page is going to be laid out, and has to compute the position of every single element on the page. There's a lot of stuff that the browser is doing during that initial load of the page as it's receiving bytes of information from the server. And as the browser goes through and does all of this, the next thing that the browser is going to do that's really meaningful is going to start painting some of that stuff back to the page. And we want to measure when that painting operation begins, when the first thing painted to the page happens. It's a pretty meaningful milestone that we want to be able to measure, because if that's taking a long time to get there, then there again, nothing else really matters after that. Everything else is going to slow down after that. And the way we can measure that is with a metric called first contentful paint. There's also a metric called first paint that measures the very first thing painted. But what's interesting about first contentful paint is that it actually measures when something more meaningful shows up for the visitor and something that the visitor would actually recognize as important content on the page. So first contentful paint becomes another really important metric to keep an eye on and make sure that it's not slow, because if it is slow, then that's going to mean that everything else on your website is slow. Largest contentful paint is going to be slow. That's one of the core vitals metrics. And if first contentful paint is slow, then interaction times are probably going to be slow as well. So you'll probably see higher interactions next paint times too. So as we move through the website load, right, we've talked about the beginning, we talked about the middle, now we're at the end. What does it mean for a website to be done loading? In this case, we want to measure when the initial part of the website is done loading. So once the page has kind of gone through and it's done all the stuff that it initially needs to do. Maybe the page will change after it as visitors start interacting, but we need to at least get to that completion of the initial load. And one way we can measure when we get to the completion of the initial load is by looking at when visitors can begin interacting with the page. So we aren't talking here about actual interactions. That's what interaction to next paint measures. We're talking about the potential. Potentially, when can visitors begin interacting with this page? And at this point, right, visitors can actually start using the page. They can start scrolling through the page. They can start clicking on the page. They can really start using it. And most visitors at this point would say, yeah, the page is done loading. I can start using it reliably at this point. And a metric we can use to measure that is a metric called time to interactive. Time to interactive says, when did we arrive at a point where visitors could reliably interact with this particular page? And again, time to interactive is about the potential point at which visitors can interact, whereas interaction to next pane is about the time that it actually took visitors to interact. So time to interactive is more helpful to understand the website overall loading process, and interaction to next pane is more helpful to look at for specific interactions on your website. Another metric we can use to understand interactions is something called total blocking time. So total blocking time measures how busy the website is, and the busier the website is, that's going to delay how quickly the browser will be able to respond to visitor interactions, right? So that it relates back to that input delay time we were talking about with interaction next pane, total blocking time, interaction to next pane's input delay. Those are similar ideas about how blocked up or how busy was the browser and how unable was the browser to respond. So total blocking time becomes another helpful metric to look at, to understand how long does it take for the website to complete doing stuff before visitors can actually begin interacting with the page. Now, another way that we can think about when the website is done loading is by thinking about how the website is displayed. At what point is enough of the website presented back to the visitor that the visitor look and say, yeah, most of the page exists. And there's a few different metrics we can use. And we've got 3 different metrics represented here in this graphic on this slide. So the first metric we can use is the one at the top of the page, right? We can just chart the total time it takes for the website to appear. And we can see that on Amazon's website here that nothing really showed up at the 3-second mark other than the header. At the 4-second mark, more stuff started to show up, and then some more things came in at 12 to 15 seconds. So in this case, visitors would probably say most of the website was there at the 4-second mark. So that's one way of understanding how long it takes the website to paint everything or present everything back to the page. We can also look at the percentage, and we can say, oh, okay, at 4 seconds, we're only 68% of the way there. It took 15 seconds for Amazon's website to get to 100% of things being visually available on the page, for the page to be visually complete. So we can look at the percentages, we can look at the time, but a more helpful metric we can use, and the one that we tend to use more, is a metric called speed index. It's really not a great name, but what speed index is looking at is it's measuring how much time was spent loading the page's design during the entire load. So what this is telling us is that about 6 seconds, 6.088 seconds, of those 15 seconds was painting things to the page. So that becomes an interesting way of understanding how long it takes things to be painted to the page. So if we look at this and we say, oh, okay, it's 6 seconds to paint the page, but if we can improve that and get that down to 5 seconds or 4 seconds, then all of a sudden we're going to make a meaningful difference in getting the website to load faster for visitors. So those are some of the important metrics that you want to start looking at just to mark some of these important milestones throughout the website loading process. The last thing I want to talk about here today is how website speed affects SEO and what we need to think about specifically from an SEO standpoint as it relates to website speed. So when we think about SEO, there's really 3 stages of SEO, right? The first stage of that process is something called crawling. Google has to go through and has to crawl the website and has to find all the different content that exists. So it's making requests from the website for different files. And we want to know, how long does it take for Google to make those requests? And one metric we can use to understand how long it takes Google to make those requests is something called average response time. So average response time tells us whether or not Google can crawl the website quickly. We can get average response time in Google Search Console in the crawl stats report. And on the crawl stats report, you can break this out by different file types, by different bots that Google is using. So it becomes a really interesting way to understand different segments of your website. And in this example, the average response time is 811 milliseconds. Google says that you should try and keep this under 1,000 milliseconds, and that tends to be what we see as well. If the website's under 1,000 milliseconds, they're okay. They're not going to have too many issues with Google being able to crawl the website. But once you start getting above 1,000 milliseconds, you are going to see Google struggling to crawl the website. You'll sometimes see that Google will just ratchet back how many crawls they actually have of the entire website. So you'll see crawl volume drop in total when average response time gets really high. Typically, that starts to become more of a problem as you approach like 2,000 milliseconds, so 2 seconds to make a request of the page. But you want to make sure that you keep that average response time as low as possible as you are looking at this and trying to improve website speed. So this is another metric that, especially from an SEO standpoint, that we recommend paying real close attention to and making sure it doesn't get out of control, particularly after major site updates or redesigns or redevelopments of your website. Things change, and sometimes average response time gets worse as a result. Now, the next part of SEO is Google's gone through, they've crawled everything. Now they need to figure out what to do with it. They need to process all that stuff that they got during the crawl, and then they need to organize it into a database. And this whole stuff is called indexing. That's what this stage of the process is, where Google's trying to figure out what they found in the crawl. So during the indexing stage, we want to make sure that Google is able to process all those files correctly. And in particular, we want to make sure that they're able to process our JavaScript files correctly, especially if JavaScript is needed on your website to load key content on your website. So if you have a very JavaScript heavy website, you want to make sure Google is actually able to grab all that JavaScript code and execute all that JavaScript code correctly, so that way they see all the content on your website. So one of the most important questions to ask here is, how long does it take for your website's JavaScript code to be processed? How much JavaScript code do you have in the first place? There's a few different ways you can answer that question. The screenshot we have up here, tool we really like to use for this is called Web Page Test, and they give you a processing report where they show you how much time is spent processing different things on your website. And you can see where the time is being spent. In this case, most of the time is being spent with scripting. So this is a very JavaScript heavy website, and we want to make sure that Google is able to process those JavaScript files correctly. If you start to find that you have a lot of pages that are not indexed, in particular not indexed in the not indexed report, it says crawled not indexed or discovered not indexed, that probably means Google's struggling to execute your JavaScript files. You want to think through that, and you want to understand how you can improve your JavaScript to make it easier for Google to index pages correctly. The final stage of the SEO process, we've crawled the website, we've indexed the website, now Google needs to rank the website, right? And this is where Core Vitals comes into play. So Google has given all kinds of conflicting information around Core Vitals. And just in the last few months, they've said that Core Vitals is a ranking factor, and they've also said Core Vitals is not a ranking factor. In the past, they've said it's a minor ranking factor. They've also said that it leads to a ranking boost, but not necessarily a ranking factor. Whatever it actually is, how we tend to see Core Vitals play out is that it is more of a ranking boost, meaning all the other factors are really good on a website, and Google's trying to decide between two different websites that are both equally good. So if your website is about as good as your competitor websites, but your website loads a little bit faster, you'll usually rank a little bit higher than your competitor websites. Or if the competitor's website is better, they might rank a little bit higher. And that makes a little bit more sense when you think about what Google's trying to do, right? Google is not trying to rank really fast websites in search results. Google is trying to rank websites that are relevant, that are high quality, that are trustworthy, that are authoritative, and so on, right? So Google is trying to look at all those other factors. They're going to rank websites that maybe are a little slow, that are really high in those other factors. That doesn't mean your website can be really slow necessarily. You want to make it as fast as you can, but you have to balance that against all those other things that Google is prioritizing and thinking about on the website. So if you have really great content and you have really great reputation and you have really high authority and your website's really trustworthy and you happen to be really fast, then Core Vitals will probably work to your advantage. If those other factors aren't that great, you have a lot of low quality content, and you happen to have a really fast website, you're not going to rank that well. So you can keep an eye on Core Vitals in a few different ways. PageSpeed Insights is one way. I was talking about that one before with Interaction Next Paint. You can also keep an eye on the Core Vitals report in Google Search Console to see how things are trending over time. And you want to compare this to how things are trending with performance as well. So if you see that there's a big jump in Core Vitals and they have a lot of poor URLs suddenly coming up or a whole lot of needs improvement URLs coming up, look at your performance. If performance doesn't seem to be affected, that's probably not going to affect your SEO performance all that much, right? If you're still getting traffic, you're still getting clicks, you're still getting impressions, you're still ranking just fine, even if Core Vitals looks bad, then that's okay. But where this becomes a bigger problem is if Core Vitals starts to look bad and you're starting to lose rankings, you're starting to lose clicks, you're starting to lose impressions. That's when you want to pay a little bit more attention to Core Vitals. And that gets to the idea that we talk about all the time with our clients, that technical SEO is a lot more than speed. And that's not to say that speed doesn't matter. Speed does matter, but only to a point. What you want to do is you want to get speed to a point where it's fast enough, where it's not getting in Google's way, crawling your website, indexing your website, ranking your website. And you want to make sure that your speed is fast enough where it's not going to prevent users from being able to use your website relatively easily. But once you're at that point where things are good enough with website speed, then you want to think about all these other factors that go into technical SEO. You want to think about your site structure and your content and how things are linked together. You want to make sure that your HTML and your schema are correctly communicating the semantic structure of the website. You want to make sure that your JavaScript is rendering things correctly, not just in terms of how fast the JavaScript is loading, but that the JavaScript actually works for Google. You want to make sure that redirects and errors are handled properly, and on and on and on, right? There's lots of other factors that we need to think about technical SEO. Speed is one of those. Speed is an important one, to be sure, but speed needs to be balanced against all the other things that are going on. So once speed is good enough, make sure that you're focusing on these other factors as well, because ultimately that's what Google wants. They want really good websites that also happen to be really fast. So if you want help making your website fast enough or checking if your website is fast enough, I hope you check out my new book. It's called Speed Metrics Guide, and it goes through all the different metrics that you can use on your website to evaluate website speed. So it goes through each metric in detail, talking about what that metric is, how that metric matters, and how it relates to other metrics on your website, where that metric fits in the overall process of loading the website. And this book is written for everybody involved in website speed, from developers to designers to SEOs, marketers, business leaders. If you're working on improving your website speed, then this book hopefully provides a really good reference for you to understand what those metrics are that you should be using, how you need to think about those metrics, and what you need to do if those metrics are a little bit slower than they should be. So the book is available on Amazon, both Kindle and paperback. You can check it out on Amazon, or you can get there directly with speedmetricsguide.com. So I hope you check that out. I know some of you on this webinar already have purchased a copy, sent me feedback about it. So thank you so much to those of you who have done that. Really appreciate it. So hope you check that out. So at this point, we have a little bit of time left in the webinar today. So definitely want to get to any questions that you have. So please send those along in chat if you haven't already. And while you are posting in those questions, I'll just throw up this slide real quick. With our contact info, both Andrea and I are happy to hear any questions you have even after today's webinar, so feel free to email us. We both tend to share a lot of information about technical SEO and speed on LinkedIn, so if you haven't already, please follow both of us on LinkedIn. And then I also have a lot of free resources on my website, matthewedgar.net, so feel free to check those out as well, both related to speed as well as technical SEO more generally. So with that, let's hop over to some questions. Andrea, what questions came in?
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. We have a couple from Alberto, so we'll start with those. The first one is, when Page Speed Insights says that there's unused JavaScript and CSS on a page, but that code is global, how can I prevent that code from showing on a page? Maybe there's an easy way to prevent that in a CMS?
Easy, not as much, but there are ways. The way that you have to do it is you have to start thinking about your JavaScript in a different way. Instead of having a global JavaScript file, you need to chunk that JavaScript file down into different parts. So there are going to be some JavaScripts that are just global. They relate to your header, they relate to your footer, right? They relate to just elements that are on every page. But by chunking that JavaScript down into different modules, you can get to a point where, okay, this is the JavaScript that's only for this form. This JavaScript is only for pages with video. This JavaScript is only for pages, with this calculator or whatever other features there are. And by chunking that JavaScript down, then you can use specific JavaScript files in specific places on specific templates. So when you're looking at your WordPress templates, instead of having a single template that maybe tries to work for all pages, you have individual templates for different page types, and you put those JavaScript files on those specific pages where there will be those specific elements. So easy? No, it's a pretty hard process to go through and think about how you restructure your JavaScript and how you restructure your templates to use that JavaScript, how you write in conditional statements to load in JavaScript files if certain elements are present. But it can be very effective to do that, particularly if you have a lot of JavaScript on there and if you are seeing that come back as a problem in PageSpeed Insights. That's one of the most effective ways we've seen of doing that. But it is a bigger undertaking and a bigger process to be able to do that and to do it well and make sure that it really is going to fix the problem.
Another one from Alberto. Where in Google Search Console can I find the information on response time?
So average response time is in crawl stats. So if you go in the sidebar and click on settings, then after you click on settings, it will load a page that has a bunch of different things on there. Kind of in the middle of the page, there's going to be a section that says crawl stats, and there's going to be a link that says open report next to it. So you can click on that, and then that will load the crawl stats report.
If anybody else has any questions, please feel free to post those in chat, but I'll throw out a few others that we got ahead of the webinar, as well as ones that we just hear a lot from people. So one of them being, how often should you evaluate website speed?
We typically recommend evaluating website speed in a couple different places. On a routine basis, you probably want to evaluate website speed at least monthly on your website and just look at some of those key metrics. So some of the ones I was going through, right? The time to first byte, to understand the beginning of the website load, first contentful paint, to understand the critical rendering path, the middle stages of the website load, and then looking at time to interactive, looking at start render. Those will give you a good idea of some of those key milestones. Looking at core vitals every month can be good too, just to get a sense of how things are shifting, how things are changing. Do you have any problems? You can also just start to get some baselines of, okay, I know basically where my time to first byte is. That's on a routine basis. On a more one-off basis, if you're doing any major website updates, redesigns, redevelopments, replatforming, anything like that, you want to measure your website speed, ideally before you launch, right after you launch, and then keep an eye on it for a few weeks after you launch that, to make sure that website speed hasn't changed in any fundamental way, or at least not gotten worse in any fundamental way. Hopefully, if anything, it's gotten better. But those are those big kind of projects. That's where you really want to focus on your website speed at those points. And in those cases, you probably want to go a little bit deeper than some of the kind of the key metrics. You might want to dig into very specific metrics as well that can help more with diagnostics, particularly if it's related to a lot of changes within there.
Perfect. We have three more. So from Eric, is INP going to consider if debouncing is implemented to purposefully create a delay on a field to avoid events from occurring? Thinking of debouncing is added to delay queries on a field that's watching keyboard key up events. Fuzzy search is an example.
Yeah, it could. I hadn't thought through that or seen anybody talk about that specifically, but knowing how IMP works, yeah, it would potentially affect that. Right, if somebody's going in, they're typing in a form, you're delaying that response intentionally. So somebody's typing a word, you're waiting until a whole word comes in or something like that. Yeah, that could potentially affect IMP because it would delay the browser's ability to start processing something in response to that interaction. But typically you probably aren't going to delay that 200 milliseconds or longer. That'd be a pretty long delay. To have it, be, that long. So I would just say, as long as you can kind of keep that delay a little bit shorter, you're going to probably be okay. If that delay is 200 milliseconds for some reason, then you're probably going to run up against INP, and you're going to, probably start pushing things out further, where it could be a problem. But as long as you keep that delay quicker, and then so long as the ultimate response is able to process a little bit faster, you should be okay.
From Lee, what are your thoughts on lazy loading of YouTube videos? I've heard conflicting opinions about using this method.
It can work in the right circumstances. So with any kind of lazy loading, you never want to lazy load anything that's at the top of the page. So anything that's at the top of the page needs to come in first on the website, right? It needs to be loaded right away. So if you are telling the browser, hey, lazy load this thing, but then it's at the top of the page, it shouldn't be lazy loaded, that's going to be a problem, because then the browser is going to have two conflicting pieces of information. It's going to say, but it's at the top of the page, I shouldn't lazy load it, but your code is saying lazy load it, and it's going to struggle with that. So in those circumstances, you should not lazy load it. That goes for images as well as any kind of video content. You wouldn't lazy load anything at the top of the page. But if that video is lower on the page, and something you have to scroll down to, lazy load can be a really good way to load that. Now, what can sometimes happen if you lazy load it, depending on how you're lazy loading it, it can be harder for Google to crawl that video, particularly if you're not even loading that video to the page at all, right? There's just an empty container. And then as you scroll down, then you bring in the video. Maybe Google won't see that video at all during a crawl. But that said, if it's lower on the page, Google's probably not going to index that video as it is. With changes Google made to how they index videos and process videos and rank videos on websites at the end of last year. So you probably wouldn't have too much effect from that from an SEO standpoint as it is, even if you are using lazy loading methods lower on the page. So the main takeaway is, anything at the top of the page, don't use lazy loading. Anything lower on the page, lazy loading, yeah, it's a very effective way to improve website speed, because you're not having to load the video on the initial load until people actually scroll down to where they can see it.
And our last question from Marissa, what are your favorite tools to measure site speed or performance?
The tool we like the best for kind of an overall look at site speed is web page test. So there's both a free version and a paid version of web page test that you can use. The free version, though, is really robust, gives you a lot of options within there. You can do more with the paid version, obviously, but you can get a lot out of the free version. Web page test also gives you a lot of kind of details to dig into different pieces and parts of the website, and really understand how specific files are loading. You can also do interesting things, web page tests, where you reload a page without files, or without any JavaScript files, or without any images, or without specific third-party scripts. This gives you a great way to just diagnose what's going on the website. So web page test is probably one of the best, more robust tools. Page speed insights, you kind of have to use to understand core vitals and get Google's look at it. Along with page speed insights, Google also has Chrome User Experience Report, which is a looker report that they've created that gives you all the access to the Chrome user experience data. So it becomes really helpful to use that. And then there's a lot of specific ones that are good for specific kind of metrics, like debug bears, IMP profiler, or debug bear also has ones that are really good for analyzing HTML code, CSS code, that kind of stuff. But if you're looking for a good overall one, I'd stick with web page test. And then if you're looking for Google's view of things, I'd stick with page speed insights. It's probably the better tools to use.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. If you have any other questions as you kind of process all this information that Matthew went over today, again, please feel free to reach out to us at the information shared. We'll also be sending out a recording of the webinar to everyone, and in that we'll also include some of these tools that we just went over as resources that you can go check out as you start to explore page speed and INP on sites you're working on. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you just have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll look forward to hearing from all of you soon. Take care. Bye, everyone.